Chapter 5, Variations in Consciousness. Basic questions we're going to be addressing in Lecture 1. What is consciousness? Why do we sleep? What are the various methods of studying sleep? What happens in our brains while we sleep? What are the effects of sleep deprivation? What are the different types of sleep disorders? So let's start with this question. What is consciousness? I want to tell you a story about a high school teacher I had. I believe I was in 10th grade, and his name was Mr. Fogus, and he taught creative writing. And I always remember a story Mr. Fogus told us about his time in Vietnam. So Mr. Fogus was one of those young men who was drafted into the war back in the 70s and late 60s. And off he went, and he was an army infantryman. And his job at times was to go on patrol out into the jungle and to engage the enemy. And as you can imagine, this was a very, very stressful, traumatic time for these young men. And so Mr. Fogus told us this story once where he was on patrol and he'd had this experience of floating above his body. He would be walking along, holding his rifle, as you can see, like these men are doing in this picture, and he would find himself sort of floating above his body, looking down, and along with this experience came a tremendous sense of relaxation and well-being. And so in some sense this helped him to cope with the incredible stress as well as the physical stressors, the psychological and the physical stressors of being on patrol out in the jungle. These were horrific conditions. Often during rainy season it would rain all the time without let up. There were insects and people wanting to kill you, and your friends getting killed and injured and so forth. Nobody was getting any sleep, so there was sleep deprivation and a whole host of psychological and physical stressors. So this story has always stuck with me because I remember when I was a sophomore in high school thinking, now wait a second, how is that possible? How can your mind, or whatever it is, yourself, split away from your physical body and kind of float around outside of your body? And subsequent to that, I've learned more about people who've had these sort of out-of-body experiences and so forth. And there's some spiritual or more Eastern, I guess, traditions where certainly they believe that that is possible, that the mind and the body are not of the same stuff. And this was actually a question of the early philosophers contemplating the motivating or the animating force within us. That is, who are we? Ourselves, our consciousness, our souls, for a lack of a better word. Is this something, an entity that's something separate and distinct from the biological or the organic physical body? And this was the old mind-body question, and certainly there was hundreds of years of thinking that they are completely separate, and this in part was informed by religion and so forth, having this notion that there's a soul that goes someplace after you die. That part of you that sort of lives on in some other form. It was resolved currently. Modern contemporary psychological science does not believe the mind, the soul, or the consciousness. I guess I'll leave soul out of it probably, but let's just say the mind or the consciousness is not something that's separable and distinct from the physiological body from which it arises. That is, the contemporary received view of modern academic Western psychology is that they're not separable. However, it is clear that the mind can affect the body, and we see this in cases of stress-induced illness and so forth, both mental and physical illness. And the body can certainly affect the mind. We see this again in cases of psychiatric disabilities, schizophrenia, for example. Certainly there's something going on at the level of the synapse with the neurotransmitters and receptor sites and so forth, and that certainly affects the mind through hallucinations and delusions and that sort of thing. So the old mind-body question really isn't really a question anymore, at least for mainstream Western academic scientific psychology, but rather there's a biological basis to the mind. You can't separate the mind or the consciousness out from the body from which it arises. So that's how we're going to proceed. Mainstream Western academic psychology. So let's define what we mean by consciousness, since this chapter is all about consciousness. Awareness of internal and external stimuli. That's the definition of consciousness that we're going to proceed with. Actually, there's entire courses that you could take on consciousness, what it is, how it has evolved, and so forth over time. A tremendous tradition in areas and domains outside of mainstream Western academic psychology, and certainly explore those sources if you choose. But this is how we're going to define consciousness for the purposes of this class. Awareness of internal and external stimuli. So think of consciousness as whatever's going on between your ears. So the lion's share of this chapter is dedicated to this topic, sleep. And so we're going to focus on sleep and dreaming, and then some variants on consciousness in our lectures. So let's start with sleep. Who needs it? Well, here's some data. Now, depending on your age, you can see that there's different levels of sleep needed per day. So my 13-year-old or my 14-year-old daughter will need about 9 to 10 hours of sleep a night on average. And then there's always variability, but this is the typical range that the science suggests is healthy for an individual. Whereas adults, 7 to 8 hours. Now, I suspect that most adults, and I say this based on some research that I've done on this, that most people, teenagers and adults, are getting nowhere near the sleep that they probably need. So everybody sleeps, even non-human animals sleep, so there must be something going on there with respect to evolution, that if we buy into this theory that we've evolved as well as non-human animals have evolved over time, and we've retained certain behavioral tendencies and psychological traits that have helped us survive, then there must be some function. So why do we sleep is a basic question, and we're going to take a look at a couple of possible explanations from an evolutionary standpoint. First one is the circadian rhythms explanation. That is, over the millennia, we've become synced biologically to the cycle of night and day. And if you look at this clock, you can see that there's a lot of different changes and fluctuations in various biological processes over the course of a 24-hour period. So think of circadian rhythms as this sort of fluctuation in biological functions over the course, and consciousness over the course of a 24-hour period. A couple of little things I want to point out here. Melatonin, for example, this is a hormone that is sleep-inducing. So there's these mechanisms in your brain that begin to put us to sleep, and there's mechanisms in the brain that wake us up. One of the mechanisms that you learned about was the reticular activating system in the brain, but there's also hormones being secreted that facilitate this awake and arousal and sleep pattern, and melatonin is one of them. So around 2100 hours, melatonin secretion begins, and then you begin to drop off to sleep, and this varies from person to person. So around 9 o'clock or so, people begin to get drowsy, and then you fall asleep at some point. And then we see, as we kind of move ahead on the clock here, around 7:30 a.m., melatonin secretion stops. And this is, of course, going to vary from person to person, but these are general time stamps. And then the arousal process is beginning. So you wake up. So somewhere, and this is the case for most of us, somewhere in the evening, we begin to feel sleepy, and we eventually fall asleep, and then sometime in the morning, we begin to wake up. And this is linked to the night-day pattern. So there's circadian rhythms, so to speak, that are linked to this night-day pattern that have been established over the course of time through the process of evolution, seems to have some adaptive function. That is, it helps us get along in the world in a way that helps us live long enough to reproduce. Circadian rhythms. A couple other evolutionary bases. We have the adaptive function hypothesis. Essentially, you can think of the adaptive function hypotheses as including the reduction of exposure to predators. So seemingly nature or selection favored those who holed up during the night, found a cave or some safe spot to live in or to stay the night in, as predators who hunt at night were active. The restorative function, that is, there's hormone secretion and production, like growth hormone, for example, is synthesized and produced at night. Cells used in our immune system are being produced at night. So there's a restorative function and the conservation of energy. This is the hypothesis with the strongest support, seemingly. And if you look at other non-human animals, they sleep all the time. So why do animals take naps all the time? Well, they do it to conserve energy. So if there's an extended period of time during this 24-hour night-day period that we can rest and restore energy, that's going to give us the resources or help us conserve the resources that we need to chase our food during the day. Sleep research. So people that do research, and both clinical or applied research and as well as basic research in sleep, typically use a collection of instruments. The EEG, which you're probably familiar, is a device that measures brain electrical activity. And we're going to be looking at some characteristic patterns, EEG patterns, that are present during sleep in a couple of minutes. But the EEG is one of those instruments that if you're in a sleep study, you will be almost certainly to encounter. This guy here in this image has sensors on his scalp, and those are sensors that lead to an EEG. Then there's the electromyograph that measures muscle activity. So we want to know what's happening in people's muscles. So there's some sleep disorders, for example, like restless legs, that you want to be able to map out or capture muscle activity in different parts of the body, like the legs, and the electromyograph will pick up on that. The electrooculograph measures eye movement. So there's one stage of sleep that we're going to be talking about in a minute called REM, rapid eye movement. So sometimes you want to be able to detect whether somebody's entering REM or exiting or not going into REM at all during sleep. And that electrooculograph will pick up on the eye movements. And then the last is the electrocardiograph that measures heart rate activity or heart activity. Other methods, and then typically in a sleep study, you're hooked up to all those leads, and then those leads go into a device. And this is here where all the leads are being collected down here. And then off they go to a polysomnogram. And then the sleep doctor will interpret all the data that has been collected, usually over a certain period of time of sleep, and then usually a determination of whether or not there's a diagnosable sleep problem or whatever it is that the person is interested in discovering will be able to be determined from that polysomnogram interpretation. Other methods include observation. So typically in a sleep study environment, there's a camera. So for example, if somebody is suffering from sleepwalking and you need a diagnosis, you want to be able to capture that on video. There's technicians watching, seeing if there's anything going on of interest. Participant self-report is another one of those things that researchers and clinicians rely on. So, for example, we now know that most dreaming occurs during this stage of sleep known as REM. How do we know that? Well, sleep studies have been done in which you can observe somebody entering into that stage of sleep both through the EEG and through the electrooculograph. As the eyes begin to move, and then if you wake those individuals up and you ask them what was going on for you, then more often than not they will be able to report that they will be dreaming. So sometimes just asking a research participant or maybe somebody that's trying to seek a diagnosis for some problem is a good source of data. Concept check for you here. What evolutionary explanation of why we sleep has the strongest support? So we looked at circadian rhythms and a couple of the adaptive function hypotheses a couple slides ago. The answer is conservation of energy. What sleep-inducing hormone kicks in around 9 p.m.? We talked about this hormone when we were looking at the circadian rhythm biological clock. And that hormone is melatonin. Third question, what does the EEG monitor? So we look at the collection of instruments that feed into a polysomnogram. The EEG measures brain wave activity. All right, so let's look at these different stages of sleep. Now, sleep is the focus of chapter 5 in your text, largely because it represents the greatest fluctuation in consciousness that we experience during the 24-hour period. Sleep, however, is not a binary phenomenon. It's not on again, off again, but rather there's different stages of sleep. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these sleep stages. So in the past, and this is the model represented in your text, sleep was described as existing in or progressing in 5 stages. So we're going to look at those 5 stages here, and this is in the past, and then I'm going to present you a more contemporary model. So let's take a look here. So when we're alert and awake, and we're going to look at these characteristic EEG tracings for each of these states of consciousness. So when we're alert and wakeful, we see a beta wave pattern, sort of high frequency, low amplitude brainwave activity in the EEG. And then just before sleep, this is when you're drowsy. There's a characteristic change in the EEG pattern. Now we see what are called alpha waves, and actually you see alpha wave patterns when people are meditating as well. So what's happening is the frequency is less and the amplitude is beginning to increase. Stage 1, this is stage 1 of the 5 stages of sleep. We see theta waves. Stage 2, we see what are called sleep spindles. These are little spikes you see away from sort of the center point of the waveform, and waves that are called K-complexes. Stage 3 and stage 4 is known as slow wave sleep, characterized by what are called delta waves, and these are a nice high amplitude, low frequency EEG tracing. And then the 5th stage is REM, rapid eye movement, sometimes referred to as paradoxical sleep, because you see the waveform in REM is very similar to the waveform we see when we're alert and wakeful. So in the past, sleep was described as having 5 stages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Currently, that is as of 2007, the 3rd and 4th stages were combined into 1 stage, right? That would be N3. So we can think of the sleep cycle as consisting of non-REM, otherwise known as NREM and REM periods, and the current stages are N1, N2, and N3. So N3 essentially is the combination of the old stages 3 and 4. And now we have N1, N2, N3, and REM. So there was very little to discriminate between stages 3 and 4, so they combined them into 1 stage, N3. So we're going to take a look at each one of these stages and some of the psychological and physical characteristics. So let's look at stage N1. We spent about 1 to 12 minutes in N1. Characteristic waveform is theta waves. A couple things that are going on physically and psychologically. We have what are called these myoclonic or hypnic jerks, and you might have experienced this before. You're just dropping off to sleep and all of a sudden you jerk awake. One explanation of why we sort of jerk awake like that, and it's really annoying because you're just about to fall asleep and then you are awake now, is that when we begin to drop off to sleep, we sense that we're falling, and then our body sort of reflexively try to catch itself. Hypnagogic images you can think of as being dreamlike mentation. That is, we might hallucinate. When I was in college, we'd go on these long road trips. We'd drive through the night, and of course that we shouldn't be doing that, but we did. So you're sleep deprived, begin to fall off to sleep, and then all of a sudden you see something run across the road. And nothing actually ran across the road, but rather it was a hypnagogic image. It was a hallucination. Dreamlike, but not actually a dream. So hypnagogic images and myoclonic jerks, or the hypnic jerks, are two things that are going on often in stage N1. And then we drop into N2, spend about 10 to 25 minutes in N2, and then you see that mixed EEG pattern, sleep spindles and K complexes and so forth. And sleep researchers can discriminate between the stages of sleep that you're in by looking at the EEG patterns. That's how we discriminate. And then stage N3, which is the combination of 3 and 4. Spend about 30 minutes in N3, and this is that stage that's characterized by those delta waves, very, very high amplitude, low frequency delta wave pattern. And then something interesting happens. We cycle back up, stage 2, stage 1, and then we enter REM stage, which is currently the 4th stage of sleep. So initially a few minutes in REM, and then we spend progressively more time in REM, maxing at about 40 minutes towards the end of the night. So most of the time in REM, the longest periods of time that we're spending in REM is happening later on in the night's sleep. And then, as I mentioned before, the EEG pattern is similar to the beta waves that we see when we're awake and aware, so it's referred to sometimes as paradoxical sleep. And then, thus it's named, the REM stage, rapid eye movements. You can see eyes in orbit moving back and forth. So if you've ever done this, if you ever watched somebody sleep, a little bit creepy, but on occasion maybe you'll see somebody sleeping, and if their eyes are moving back and forth rapidly, then they're in probably an REM stage of sleep. And if you woke them up, what would they report? Probably that they would be dreaming. They would probably report that they were dreaming. Another thing that happens during REM sleep is our large skeletal muscles are essentially paralyzed. So there's a mechanism in the brain that shuts off our skeletal muscles. The reason for that is that sometimes dreams can be very vivid, very active, and nature built into this, into our brains, this switch that can be shut off so that we're not going to be thrashing around and damaging ourselves or our bed partners while we're in sleep. And we're going to talk about a sleep disorder in a couple of minutes in which that switch is broken and people essentially thrash around and injure themselves and their bed partners in sleep. But we'll get to that in a minute. So here's a graphic showing the sleep cycle. So what's happening is this. We're cycling through this 1, 2, 3, 2, 1 REM phase about 4 times per night. Right? And then we're spending progressively more time in REM as the night progresses. So at the end of the night, we're spending most of our time in REM sleep. So we're cycling through this about 4 times per night. Concept check for you. Anne's EEG pattern shows low frequency, high amplitude wave pattern. What stage of sleep is she in? She would be in delta sleep. That would be stage N3. Steve walks nearly every night. He also reports vivid dreams upon awakening in the morning. Could it be that he's acting out his dreams while sleepwalking? Why or why not? Answer is probably not. If he's sleepwalking, probably not in REM, because in REM sleep, we have that mechanism in the brain that shuts off our large skeletal muscles. So sleepwalking is not likely to occur during REM sleep. All right, so I mentioned before that most adults and teens are probably sleep deprived, but let's just find out. So take a look at this little survey. Do you need an alarm clock to wake up? Do you struggle to get out of bed in the morning? Hit the snooze button weekday mornings. Are you tired, irritable, and stressed out at work, school? Do you have trouble concentrating and remembering? Slow critical thinking, problem solving, creativity? Do you often fall asleep watching TV? Do you fall asleep in boring meetings, lectures, warm rooms? Fall asleep after heavy meals or low doses of alcohol? Do you often fall asleep while relaxing after dinner? Do you fall asleep within 5 minutes of going to bed? Do you often feel drowsy when driving? Do you sleep extra hours on weekend mornings? How about needing a nap to get through the day? So if you answered yes to 3 or more of these questions, you are probably sleep deprived. And when I teach this course in face-to-face courses, almost 100% of my students are reporting sleep deprivation. So we are a sleep deprived population generally. We need sleep, though. Some of the research that suggests we need sleep includes studies that have gone in and selectively deprived individuals of stages of sleep. So if somebody's in a sleep study, they're hooked up to an EEG, the researchers can go in and essentially wake them up every time they enter either REM or slow wave sleep, that's N3, punch out essentially these stages of sleep, and then see what the effects are. So when individuals in these studies have been selectively deprived of REM or slow wave sleep, we show what's called a rebound effect. And what that means is that when we're allowed to sleep normally, thereafter we spend more time in whichever of these sleep stages that we've been deprived. So if somebody's been deprived of REM, they'll spend more time in REM. If they've been deprived of slow wave sleep, N3, then they'll spend more time in slow wave sleep. This is the rebound effect. And what this suggests is that we need REM and delta sleep. And biologically, there's important things going on during these stages of sleep, particularly slow wave. So we need sleep. But we're not getting enough of it. What are some of the effects? So here's a whole constellation of possible effects. I'm not going to read all of these, but I'm just going to touch on a couple. One is the mood takes a hit. So if you've ever done an all-nighter, chances are you've been kind of irritable the next day. Cognitive impairment. Certainly we slow down our mental processing. We can't multitask as effectively. Impaired immune system. So chronic sleep deprivation can and has been shown scientifically to impair the immune system. There's other risk factors, diabetes and heart disease, other sort of afflictions that are associated with chronic sleep deprivation. There's hormones, again, being secreted and processed and utilized during sleep, growth hormone, for example. So growth suppression can result from excessive sleep deprivation. So there's this whole host of physical problems and psychological problems that can occur due to chronic sleep deprivation. Disasters that have been directly linked to sleep deprivation include Exxon Valdez, and this lower left image is a image of that disaster. So the captain of the Exxon Valdez, which was a large oil tanker, ran aground up in a pristine wilderness area in Alaska, absolutely destroyed. Hundreds of square miles of pristine wilderness. 3 Mile Island, which was a near nuclear meltdown. Chernobyl and so forth, plane crashes, car accidents. So there's a whole host of issues and disasters that have been directly linked to sleep deprivation. So largely these people, for example, at these nuke plants are shift workers, maybe working double or triple shifts, and so they become sleep deprived, and so they can't really do their jobs very effectively. Medical residents making mistakes. So as a medical resident, you're spending a lot of time at the hospital and you're not getting a whole lot of sleep. And so with the cognitive impairments and physical impairments and so forth, chances are you're going to make more mistakes if you're sleep deprived. So concept check for us here. What happens when we're selectively deprived of REM and or slow wave sleep? So this is when we go in and we punch out those stages of sleep out of somebody's a normal sleep cycle. What do we see happening? Thereafter, when we're allowed to sleep normally, what we see is known as the rebound effect. We spend more time in those stages of sleep that we've been deprived of. Can you name 3 effects of sleep deprivation? So on the prior slide, we saw a whole collection of problems, both physical and psychological, associated with sleep deprivation. Can you name 3 of them? Here's 3: cognitive impairment, motor impairments, immune system impairments. So be sure to review those effects of sleep deprivation. So last bit here I want to talk about today in this lecture are sleep problems. There's 2 major classes of diagnosable sleep conditions. Those are the dysomnias and the parasomnias. Think of the dysomnias as those problems that involve either falling asleep or staying asleep. So insomnia we'll start with. That's the most common. About 35% of adults report having insomnia at some point. Insomnia involves problems falling asleep and staying asleep. So some people have insomnia that involves them not being able to get to sleep at night, and then other people have what's called early waking insomnia. That is, they'll wake up somewhere around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and then not be able to fall back asleep. Narcolepsy is another one of these dysomnias, and that involves an uncontrollable dropping into sleep. So you can be driving, you could be at a movie, you could be in class, and you'll suddenly fall asleep. Sleep apnea is one of the problems we're hearing more about these days. If you look at this lower right image, here's a man probably has sleep apnea. This device is known as a CPAP machine, and it's the frontline treatment of sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is basically your breathing is stopping many times during sleep. So essentially you're suffocating, and the treatment involves this machine which forces you to breathe. The parasomnias you can think of as things that kind of go bump in the night. These are events that interrupt a normal night's sleep. And I wanted to just talk about a couple of different brands of parasomnias. We have the REM related and the non-REM. So we have parasomnias that are associated with the REM stage of sleep. One of them is REM behavior disorder, and this is that disorder that involves the switch that turns off your skeletal muscles in REM sleep being broken. So people with REM behavior disorder can act out their dreams, essentially. It's prevalent among older adults, so you have these older adults sort of thrashing around and hitting their arms on bedside tables and lamps and injuring themselves and strangling their bed partners and kicking them, and it's just sort of an awful disorder. Fortunately, it's treatable with muscle relaxants and so forth. Then you have the non-REM behavior or non-REM parasomnias, which include one class are the arousal disorders. They're known as arousal disorders because these disorders occur outside of REM sleep, usually in slow wave or stage 2 sleep, and they're partial arousals out of deeper stages of sleep. So on the EEG pattern, you can see somebody with an arousal disorder sort of spike up. They might be in stage 2, and then they sort of spike back up into stage 1 without fully gaining consciousness. They don't fully wake up, so they're kind of stuck somewhere between sleep and being awake. A couple of different types of non-REM arousal disorders. We have confusional arousals, which involve somebody waking up or appearing to wake up and they're completely confused. They don't know who they are, where they are. They might scream. They might react with terror to whatever's going on at that moment. And they are essentially completely confused. And this can go on from anywhere from 30 seconds to, in some cases, to half an hour. And it's problematic because if it continues to happen, it's very disturbing for the individual, as well as the people that are sharing the space with this individual, bed partner, roommate, or something like that. Somnambulism is just a fancy word for sleepwalking, getting up, right? Confusional arousals, we can say, sort of become sleepwalking when the foot hits the floor, so to speak. So somnambulism involves getting out of bed and going somewhere, usually moving around. Not always does it involve getting out of bed, but often it does. Seemingly it runs in families, so often there's a genetic basis. Families with individuals who sleepwalk usually have a lore surrounding this, that is, stories they tell about Uncle Joe or Dad or a brother or sister who is a tremendous sleepwalker. So it seems to have a genetic basis. It arises out of slow wave sleep, so we can expect this to happen after maybe 30 minutes of sleep. Typically it happens early on in the night's sleep. And then the last is sexsomnia, and I've personally done some research on this, and this involves having sex in your sleep, and by having sex I mean the full spectrum of sexual behavior, from sexualized moaning and groaning, as if you're having sex, to, in some cases, intercourse, and all this without waking up. So this is problematic for a number of reasons. It brings up, in some cases, issues of consent. So, for example, if you have a male trying to initiate sex in his sleep every night with his female bed partner, and this female bed partner takes offense to that, then you've got a relationship problem. I've had literally thousands of anecdotes of people in the research that I've done really struggling with this problem. It becomes particularly problematic in cases where minors are involved and have become recipients of unwanted sexual contact. And when the authorities become involved, they treat this as a case of sexual abuse, sexual misconduct. So once the authorities become involved and these cases have gone to trial, then nobody's life is ever the same after that. These are really kind of awful circumstances for everybody. But these are some of the sleep disorders I want you to be familiar with. Concept check here for us. Blank and blank are the two major classes of sleep disorders. A, sleepwalking, insomnia. B, narcolepsy, RBD. C, dysomnias, parasomnias. D, sexsomnia, sleep apnea. If you answered C, you are correct. Dysomnias and parasomnias are the two major classes of sleep disorders. Learning objectives for this section: define consciousness, describe the circadian rhythm and adaptive function theories of sleep, describe the various methods of studying sleep, describe the 4-stage sleep cycle and the effects of sleep deprivation, that is, selective deprivation and sleep restriction. 5, describe the major classes of sleep disorders, the dysomnias and parasomnias and their subtypes.